I'm lucky to be an Uber driver, and over the past 4 years, I've encountered some unusual situations, but this particular night was by far the scariest of my life, and it almost ended my life. It only happened last month. It was late at night, and my city is small enough to avoid the hustle and bustle of a bustling metropolis, with a population of just under 1 million. If you prefer a quieter setting, it's a short drive to the countryside or forest. I was fine with the silence since I don't need to talk constantly. His destination was outside the city in a rural area, and the drive would take about 30 minutes. As I drove, I kept glancing at him through the rearview mirror. He hadn't spoken much so far, and while the silence wasn't bothersome, there was something off about him. I'm used to all kinds of passengers, drunk people being the most common at this hour. But this guy wasn't drunk. I could tell. You develop a sense for it in my line of work. He was absorbed in his phone, and his expression troubled me. He looked angry, like a manager frustrated with his employees. I wondered what was going on, but I didn't make it my business. I continued driving. I took a turn onto a country road, and the smooth pavement gave way to rough gravel. The street lights disappeared, but the full moon provided enough light for me to see ahead. I checked my phone's map, and although his final destination wasn't far, there was nothing around, just a cornfield to the right and a forest to the left. Are you sure this is right? I asked. We're almost there, he replied. That was the first full sentence I'd gotten from him. After a few minutes, I saw light in the distance. At first, I wasn't sure what it was, but as I got closer, it became clear that it was a truck. There was a man in the front seat, though I could only barely make him out. I stopped in front of the truck, and my passenger quickly jumped out, shutting the door behind him. He climbed into the truck, and I watched in confusion. Why would someone get an Uber only to meet up with a friend at such a remote location? Why wouldn't his friend just pick him up? I didn't dwell on it. At the time, about half a mile from where I left him, I lost control of my car. All 4 tires seemed to burst at once. I swerved left and right, struggling to stay on the road, and eventually came to a stop. I sat there trying to catch my breath, then got out to inspect what happened. Sure enough, all 4 tires were flat. It wasn't a coincidence. Something was definitely wrong. Without thinking, I ran into the woods next to the road, hiding behind a tree and waiting. After a minute or two, bright headlights appeared behind my car. It was the truck from before. This time there were 3 men inside. One was my passenger, the second was the man I'd seen earlier, and the third I hadn't noticed before. They stopped in front of my car, and I left my phone behind. I was tempted to curse aloud, but stopped myself. By then I was almost certain I had fallen into a trap. They must have tampered with my tires somehow. Maybe the third guy had laid out a spike strip when I passed by earlier. The 3 men got out of the truck and walked toward my car. Where's he? One of them said. He can't be far. Hearing that, I feared for my life. I pulled my head behind the tree, trying to stay out of sight. I listened as they searched through my car. I kicked myself for leaving my phone. I was sure there had been service earlier, but maybe there was a dead spot they had planned to take advantage of. After a few minutes, the truck drove away. I was relieved they didn't come looking for me, and I took my chance to start walking through the woods. It would be a long, hour-long walk back to the main road, but I couldn't risk taking the road and being caught. Eventually, I made it to the road and flagged down a passing car. The driver called 911 for me, and the police arrived at the scene. I told them everything. We went to a nearby rest stop to talk further. One of the officers called for backup, and they headed to the spot where it had happened. When they returned, an officer showed me pictures from the scene. It was the right spot. The skid marks from my burst tires were clearly visible, but my car was gone. I never found out why they let me go. It wouldn't have been difficult for them to find me. I'm just thankful to be alive, and although my tormentors remain unfound, I've been driving a taxi for over 10 years, and I've seen it all, from cheerful and talkative Passengers to those who keep to themselves, yet nothing could have prepared me for the night. I picked up a passenger who changed my life. It was a chilly night, the kind that makes you want to stay indoors and curl up under the covers, but duty called, and I had to keep working. As I drove around the city searching for my next fare, I spotted a man standing on the corner. He was tall, dressed in a dark suit, his hands tucked into his pockets. Suddenly, he pulled one hand out and signaled for me to stop. He opened the back door and climbed in, closing it behind him. I noticed he seemed a bit anxious, glancing around the car as if searching for something. I greeted him and he nodded in response. "Where to?" I asked. He gave me an address on the other side of town. I shifted into gear and started driving. I tried to make small talk to ease the silence, but he was polite yet distant, answering my questions with brief responses. Along the way, he changed his mind and asked to be taken to a different address. We drove through a quiet, dimly lit street. Then he told me to stop in front of an old abandoned building. I hesitated, unsure of why anyone would want to go there. Still, he assured me it was safe. When we parked, he instructed me to wait in the car. I watched as he approached another man standing on the street. This second man had a shaved head and numerous tattoos, a stark contrast to my passenger, who looked like a typical businessman. I was about to drive away when I saw my passenger returning, followed by the intimidating man. Both got into the back seat. My passenger gave me directions to continue driving. Despite feeling uneasy, I couldn't refuse. As we drove, the two men spoke in hushed tones. I could only catch a few words, but I started to worry that I was being used in something criminal. My heart began racing. I knew I had two options: go along with whatever they were planning and report it afterward, or act right away. A police station was only a few blocks away, and I decided to head there. I made a sharp turn and pressed the gas pedal. As we neared the station, my passenger suddenly pulled out a gun and pointed it at me. "Don't even think about it," he said, his voice cold. I knew it was too late. The police station loomed ahead. I stopped the car and the two men bolted out. They fled into the night. My hands were trembling and my heart pounded in my chest. After regaining my breath, I walked into the station and reported what had just happened. The men were captured on security cameras, and I described them to the best of my ability. The next day, the police called me in for an interview. They had apprehended the two men and wanted my help identifying them. I saw a list of suspects when I got to the station, and I recognized my passenger right away. I pointed him out, and the police took him into jail. The other guy was also put into custody since there was evidence connecting him to the crimes. The fact that they were no longer on the streets and could not hurt anybody else over time made me happy. Even though I've been scarred by other terrifying situations, the memory of that night started to fade. When I was around 10 or 11 years old, my family traveled to Florida to visit my grandparents. They lived in a small town on the Gulf of Mexico, where the weather was warm and the beaches were beautiful. I always looked forward to these trips because I lived in the north, where the weather wasn't great all year round. Perhaps one day I'll share those stories as well, but this particular night is undoubtedly one I won't forget. We usually went in March when my brother and I had a week off from school. We always left early in the morning, well before the sun even started to rise. My dad drove most of the way, but my mom would occasionally take over so he could rest. The trip was long and we would drive straight through the night, with my dad taking the night shift. We made sure to stop every once in a while to stretch our legs and grab a quick bite. One of our stops was at McDonald's, thinking it would be a fast and simple meal. While standing in line, a man started yelling at my dad, accusing him of cutting in line. My dad tried to explain that he wasn't cutting, but the man wouldn't listen. My mom stepped in to defuse the situation, but the man was too angry. I remember feeling scared and wanting to hide, but my dad stayed calm and didn't engage with the man's aggression. After we finished eating, we got back into the car and continued on our way. However, we soon realized that the man from McDonald's was following us. We tried to ignore him, hoping he would turn off onto a different road, but he kept following as I watched him from the back window, and it made me feel very uneasy. My brother started crying, and my parents realized right away that we needed to contact the police. When my mom asked my dad what we should do, he advised her to ignore him and that soon the guy would get tired and leave us alone. Suddenly, the man struck our vehicle from back, forcing it to swing. After my mom called 911, she spoke calmly and steadily to the operator, even though I could tell she was trying to protect my brother and me. A few minutes later, we heard sirens and saw a police car pull up behind us. The other car continued to drive, and the police car followed the man. Another police car pulled up behind us, and an officer came up to us and informed us that the man had been arrested. He had been drinking, and we were informed that he was already on probation for prior violent crimes. Behavior: my dad opted to just go on the vacation after assessing the damage to our vehicle. The bumper had a big hole where he had slammed us, but the police stated it was safe. The remainder of our trip was full of laughter and fun as we spent time with our grandparents in the Florida sunshine. We visited the beach, ate delectable seafood, and explored the small town where my grandparents lived. As we drove home, I reflected on how fortunate we were to have survived that ordeal. Highway accidents are common, and we almost got run off the road by that guy. Fortunately, that didn't happen. After my second year of college, I was able to purchase my first car. I couldn't have afforded one in high school, but student loans allowed me to purchase a used Toyota Corolla. I was driving back to my parents' house for the summer, which was a big step up from the bus rides I was used to. It was about an 8-hour drive, so I made sure to leave early in the morning. After a few hours of driving, I became bored and decided not to pick up anyone. I think it might be illegal where I live, but I'm not sure. After another boring half hour, I saw a hitchhiker at the side of the road. I slowed my car as I approached him to have a look at him before making a decision. He was a younger man, probably my age, wearing a jean jacket, brown pants, and running shoes. He had a scruffy beard. Just a regular-looking man. I thought. I stopped my car on the shoulder and he jogged over. "How's it going?" I said. "Great, thanks, man. I'm Pete," he said graciously. Then I unlocked the door. He got into the front seat and I started driving. We were actually hitting it off really well. He was super funny and we had a lot in common. The time seemed to fly by and eventually it had been over an hour. It was then that I realized that Pete never told me where he was going, so I asked him. He told me that his friend had a small hobby farm close to here and he was going to visit. He said he would get out on the highway and walk the rest of the way if I didn't want to take him all the way there. At this point I felt like the two of us had become friends, so I had no problem going a little off course to save him hours of walking. I told him I'd take him all the way to the farm and that he would just have to let me know where to get off the highway. We continued driving for a while and eventually Pete told me to take the next exit. I followed his instructions and he continued to direct me until we were on a pretty remote dirt road in the country. We were surrounded by cornfields, but it all seemed like a large-scale commercial farm, not the small hobby farm I was expecting. "Are we in the right place?" I asked. "Yeah, this is it," he said casually. Where is it?" I prodded. "We're here, just let me out," he insisted. I brought the car to a stop and Pete quickly got out. Without saying a word, not even a thank you, then he started walking down the road away from my car. This left me confused. We were in the middle of nowhere. There's no way this could be where he wanted to go, but what do I know? Although I was a little put off by his rudeness, I turned my car around and started driving back the way I came. The country road had been empty until now. I hadn't seen another car or person. or anything, however, that was about to change as I was making my way back to civilization. I saw a truck on the road. It was a black pickup truck. I'm not sure what make or model. It was stopped in the middle of the road, blocking my path. I was confused at first, but then I saw another truck approaching from behind. That was when I realized that I'd fallen into a trap. Pete must have been in on it. I had only a few seconds to decide what to do because the BAS was closing in on me quickly. I looked left and saw nothing but cornfields. After a few minutes in the field, I finally made it to the highway, where I turned onto it and received at least a few stares from the other drivers when they saw me emerge. It was a close call, but it could have ended much worse. I looked right and saw more cornfields, but the highway was barely visible in the distance. I thought I could probably make it there through the field, so I turned right and started plowing through it. However, the highway was a large target, and if I kept going straight, I would eventually arrive. What really irritates me about this experience is how easily Pete won my trust. Normally, I wouldn't let a stranger lead me into the middle of nowhere by myself, but after an hour of good conversation, I was willing to let my guard down, live, and learn. I guess stay safe out there, everyone. A few years ago, I drove my car across the country because it was something I'd wanted to do for a long time. So when I accepted a job on the West Coast, I decided to use that as an excuse to cross something off my bucket list. Of course, flying would have been quicker and less expensive, but I was really excited to see some of the often overlooked parts of America. But something happened during the trip that would make me regret that choice. I had planned for the trip to last a little over a week, so I would have enough time to see some sights and avoid driving after dark, which had always seemed really scary to me. It was day 5 of my trip, and I was ahead of schedule. Utah's border was fast approaching. The Rocky Mountains were in my rearview mirror, and the sun was about to set. Seemed like a good time to stop for the night. I had been lucky enough to find a motel almost every evening so far, and I only had to sleep in my car once. Up until that point, it wasn't a very good experience, so when I saw a sign for a motel on the highway, I felt relieved. I turned off at the next exit and followed the signs until I reached the motel. The bright neon sign stood tall in front of the parking lot, the sun almost set behind it. It was a single-level building that was wrapped around the parking lot in the shape of a L. I drove my car past the sign and parked in one of the many empty spots. There were 3 or 4 other cars there out of maybe 10 or 15 spaces. I walked to the office and rented a room for the night, then made my way to the other side of the building where my room was. When I walked in, nothing struck me as odd. It was a decently clean place with a bed and TV. What more could I ask for? One thing I did notice about the place was how thin the walls were. As soon as I stepped into my room, I could hear my neighbor chatting, but I could only hear one voice, so I assumed he was on the phone. I couldn't really understand what he was saying since it was so muffled by the walls that I could only hear every 5 or 6 syllables. It was a little annoyance, but nothing more. To get some sleep so I could get back on the road early in the morning, I jumped into the shower and brushed my teeth. When I went to bed, my head was essentially against the wall where I could hear my neighbor. It sounded like 2 people were arguing and talking, and I think I heard a few words in their muffled conversation that were slang for drugs, though I can't be certain. If the walls were thin enough that I could hear talking through them, I doubt they would stop a bullet. I lay there for a few minutes and heard nothing, so I was fairly certain it was safe, so I got up and called 911. Then, after a while, they were in a full-on shouting match, and I definitely heard some swearing. It was so bad that I almost called the police, but I decided it was none of my business. Then, something happened that still makes me shiver. I heard a loud, thunderous gunshot followed by silence. I suppose someone else had already called because I heard sirens before I even told the operator where I was. When the police showed up, they asked me a few questions, and I answered as best I could about the conversation I had overheard. Of course, I told them about the gunshot, and I later discovered that no one had been harmed. I assumed it was a warning shot, and both men must have left after that, and I never heard anything more. I slept through the rest of the night, and as soon as the sun came up, I resumed driving. Although this incident could have been much worse, it still occasionally makes its way into my thoughts. A few years ago, my partner and I had reserved a weekend stay at a charming bed and breakfast in a small town not far from our home. The drive took about 4 hours, through some remote stretches of highway. We took Friday off work to make the trip, and we planned to arrive by 4 p.m., so we'd have plenty of time to check in and possibly take a stroll around town. After an hour or two, the highway became nearly deserted, with only one lane in each direction. At one point, I asked my partner to change the music, and she pointed out that we had no self-service. We didn't need access to every song, so it wasn't a big problem, but it was part of the narrative. After an additional hour, we saw a vehicle stopped on the shoulder some 300 to 400 feet in front of us, so we assumed someone was having automobile difficulties. I'm a mechanic, so I thought it might be a quick fix, perhaps a flat tire or something simple. As we got closer, I saw a man standing by the car waving at us. He was of average height with a beard and a dirty baseball cap. He looked like someone who might know how to change a tire, but you never know. I stopped behind his car and got out while my partner stayed inside. He approached me, and we met halfway between our cars. I could see there were no flat tires, and the hood was popped. He introduced himself as James, very polite and friendly at first. He seemed genuinely relieved someone had stopped to help since there was no self-service on the stretch of road. We exchanged a few words, and he thanked me several times for stopping. Then he simply asked for a ride to the nearest town so he could call for help. I offered to take a look at his car instead, pointing out that often small issues could be easily fixed, saving a lot of hassle. In an instant, his friendly smile faded into a serious frown. He paused for a moment, then forced a smile back onto his face and said, "I wouldn't want to put you through that. A ride to town is really all I need." I felt uneasy at this. It seemed like he just wanted an excuse to get into my car. If my car had been broken down, I'd have been thrilled to have a mechanic offer to help. We stood there sizing each other up in silence for a few seconds. His forced smile began to fade again, and I said calmly, "I'm happy to look at the car, but that's all I can do for you the rest of." His smile vanished. He became angry. He went on a guilt-tripping tirade about how people no longer support one another. But I remained composed and made my way back to my car, where my partner was waiting. She asked me what had happened, so I told her briefly before we drove away. I was shaken, but we didn't let it ruin our trip. But the story didn't end there. About half an hour later, we stopped at a gas station to fill up. While I was refueling, I glanced over at the highway and saw a car passing by. To my shock, it was James from earlier. Our eyes locked for a brief second before he disappeared around a corner. That's when I realized I had made the right decision by not giving him a ride. He didn't want me to fix his car because he knew there was nothing wrong with it. I can only imagine what he would have done if I had let him into my car. My partner Hadn't noticed when he drove by, and I decided not to tell her right away because I thought it might spoil the rest of our trip. We ended up having a wonderful time and never saw James again. Still, I worry he might try this on someone else and they might not be as cautious. A few years ago, I worked part-time as an Uber driver while maintaining a full-time job that required me to work from home. My daily routine left me isolated. With hardly any real-life interactions, I thought driving for Uber would be a good way to get out of my apartment and engage with people from time to time. However, after a particular incident, I decided to quit and never look back. On one evening around 8 p.m. I set out as usual. Things were slow, and in the first hour I had only 2 passengers. The first was a group of college-aged girls heading to some kind of party on a Tuesday night. The second was a single woman, likely a waitress, on her way home from work. After that, I sat idle for 10 or 20 minutes. Eventually, I received a ride request from a user with no rating. While it wasn't a major red flag, everyone has to take their first ride at some point, it felt unusual. I accepted the request and drove to the pickup spot, which wasn't far from my apartment. In fact, I passed my building on the way. When I arrived, there was no one there, so I sent a message to my passenger named Telly. Moments later, I got a reply, "Be right there." It was riddled with poor grammar. I waited for a few minutes. Usually I'd leave after 10 minutes, but I kept an eye on the clock. After 7.5 minutes, a man approached my car. He introduced himself as Telly and he appeared to be in his early 20s with a long beard and wild, bushy hair. He was slightly overweight and wore thick framed glasses. I often try to start a conversation with my passengers, but his tone told me he didn't want to talk. "How's your night going?" I asked. "Fine," Telly responded, but his voice had a detached, uninterested tone. Telly spent most of the ride staring at his phone, occasionally glancing out the window in a troubled, wary manner. He seemed nervous, his hands were trembling, and he was sweating. I even thought he might have been crying recently, though it could have been from the stress. His presence made me uneasy, and I kept watching him through the rearview mirror as much as I could. Eventually, I noticed something alarming. His hands were gripping his phone tightly, and I could see pieces of blood on them along with cuts on his knuckles. At this point, I was really frightened, but we were getting close to our destination, so I decided to call it a night and go home. The following day, while I was working at my desk, I heard a loud knock at my door. I got up and cautiously approached through the peephole, and I saw 2 police officers. My heart fell, and my mind raced, trying to figure out why they were there. I opened the door slowly and said nothing, but one of the officers explained that they were looking for a suspect who was wanted for the mugging and severe beating of an elderly man. As soon as he said that, I thought of Telly, and they showed me a picture of him. I shared everything I knew with them, including details from my Uber account and dashcam footage. I don't know what happened to Telly after he was detained that day, but I tried looking for news reports about the event but couldn't find anything. As a result, I quit driving for Uber. I'm Jane, and I'm in my final year of graduate school, studying pharmacology. I find that I work best at night, so I usually spend my evenings studying at the library until quite late. At my school, the library is open until midnight most nights of the week, so it wasn't unusual for me to stay there until 2 or even 3 in the morning. The risks for drivers are just not worth it to me anymore. It's a big, contemporary, 4-story building with a computer room on the main floor. The other floors are filled with bookshelves and different study spaces. I always look for a peaceful place where I won't be bothered. One Thursday night, I arrived late, but I wasn't really getting anything done. I had my laptop out and was mostly watching YouTube videos. Eventually, I decided to call it a night because it was well past midnight, so I knew the buses wouldn't be running, so I packed up and left through the big glass doors at the front of the library while I waited for my ride. A red sedan pulled up shortly after I checked the status on my phone. I got in and greeted the driver, a man in his mid-30s with a disheveled beard, thick glasses, and a winter hat. Despite the fact that it was April, his style had a hipster vibe, so he said hi back. We began driving while I was playing a game on my phone, and the driver made a few attempts to talk to me, but I ignored him and went back to my game. Eventually, he stopped trying to engage, and we continued on our way. I didn't feel any particularly creepy vibes at that point. We arrived at my place without incident, and he dropped me off in front of my building. I lived in a first-floor apartment in an old house divided by floors with separate entrances for neighbors above and below. I thanked the driver quickly and shut the door behind me. As I looked back, the driver was still sitting there directly under a street light, staring up at me. As soon as he saw that I noticed him, he turned away. I closed the door and went to bed, falling asleep right away. The following week, I began feeling as though I was being watched at home. My apartment was on the ground floor with my bedroom at the back overlooking an alley that didn't see much foot traffic. However, I started noticing a dark figure walking past my window frequently. At first, it didn't alarm me, but one night I thought I saw him trying to peer through the window. I always kept the curtains closed, but I could see a little bit through them. When I got closer, the figure disappeared. At that point, I started feeling creeped out and thought I might be being stalked. However, I couldn't prove it. I worried that if I told anyone, they'd think I was just imagining things, so I kept it to myself. Not long after, I was studying late at the library again. It was around 11:30 when I decided to call it a night. I called an Uber and waited at the front of the building as usual. This time, though, I felt paranoid, so I entered a destination a block or so away from my actual address, thinking it would keep my location private. When my ride arrived, it was that same red sedan from before. I hadn't recognized him right away until I got in and saw his face again. I used Uber often, but this was the first time I had seen the same driver twice. As I got into the car, he seemed surprised to see me. Our eyes connected through the rearview mirror, and a chill ran down my SP line. I don't know why, but he really creeped me out this time. The car started moving, so I figured I would just take the ride. When he dropped me off in front of my building, I was relieved. I went across the street, opened my front door, and went to bed. As I lay there trying to sleep, I realized that I had entered a nearby address as my destination, but the driver had dropped me off right in front of my place. Perhaps he had a good memory, but even so, I thought they were supposed to follow the app. After what seemed like an hour or so, I fell asleep, but when I woke up, I heard a banging sound on my window. A dark shadow moved behind my curtains outside the window, and I watched in horror as the noise continued, as if someone was trying to force it open. My phone was on the bed, so I rushed over, grabbed it, and dialed 911. I was startled by the noise and quickly sat up. I quickly closed the door to my bedroom and moved the couch in front of it. The police arrived within minutes, and they caught my would-be attacker in the act. One of the officers met me at the front of the house and tried to calm me down on the porch. Then I saw another officer escorting the man in handcuffs. It was that creepy driver from before. I bet you didn't see that coming. I thanked the police officers for arriving so quickly, otherwise he might have gotten away. That night I stayed with a friend, and for the next few nights I moved out of that place. Now I have a much safer home. This happened last year when I was driving across the country alone to visit family on the East Coast. At the time I lived in Texas, and I'm afraid of flying, so I tried to avoid it whenever possible. I had made this trip a few times before and actually enjoyed having the time to myself. The trip would take 2 solid days of driving, so I would stop at a hotel or motel for a night. Along the way I was about to hours into my journey and needed to use the bathroom, so I pulled into a rest stop I had visited many times before. I wasn't far from home after all. I got out of my car and started walking toward the building when a truck pulled up next to me and someone started trying to talk to me. It was a large white transport truck, a full-sized 18-wheeler that appeared to have a full load. The truck was still running, so I couldn't hear what he was trying to say clearly. I think he offered me a ride or something. But I don't know why, because nearly everyone at that rest stop had arrived by car. I didn't think about it much at the moment, so I went into the bathroom. When I came out, the truck was gone, so I walked back to my vehicle and drove on. I didn't sure what to do, but I didn't want to seem impolite, so I simply smiled and nodded before leaving. The incident quickly slipped my mind as I continued my journey. After a few more hours, I glanced through my rearview mirror and noticed a large white truck trailing behind me in the distance. My mind went back to that guy from before, but there was no way to know for sure if it was him. White trucks are common, so it wasn't particularly concerning. Still, I couldn't help but keep an eye on my mirror for the next few hours. I didn't see the truck again. As the sun began to set, I started looking for a hotel or motel near the highway. There was a truck stop on the left side of the road with a small motel next to it. Though it wasn't luxurious for the situation, it was perfect. There was even a restaurant, which was a welcome sight since I was really hungry. After a full day of driving, I parked in the mostly empty lot and headed to the office. I rented the cheapest room and then went to the restaurant. After finishing my meal, I walked back to my room, but noticed something odd in the truck section of the parking lot. There was a truck that strongly resembled the one I had seen earlier. I walked over and peeked into the window, but it was empty. Afterward, I returned to my room, locked the door, and laid down on the bed. I fell asleep almost instantly. It was only around 9:30 p.m. But I was really tired from the day. The next thing I remember is waking up in the dark room. I could hear a noise coming from outside my room, a kind of metallic grinding sound coming from my door. I got up and approached it, then peeked through the window. There was someone out there, a man, and he was doing something to my door, trying to break in. I assumed the worst and ran over to my phone, calling 911. The man must have heard me talking to the police, because when I checked again, he was gone. I told him that someone was trying to break into my room nearby, and there was a security camera. The police then showed me an image of the man, and it was the same guy from before. I told them about his truck and the incident at the rest stop, and with that information, they were able to find and arrest him. What's even more unsettling is that I thought I was being paranoid at the time, but it turned out that I was being stalked. I'm grateful every day that I woke up at the right time, because if he had entered my room while I was asleep, it would have been a truly horrible roommate. I've been driving trucks since I was in my early 20s, and I was 35 at the time of this incident. The roads were always very quiet for the first few hours of the day, which is nice, having the road to myself for a while, especially since driving on busy roads can be pretty dangerous. I was driving down a road I don't usually use because the stretch of my normal route was closed for construction, so I had to take an alternate route. I was hauling garbage across the border between Canada and the United States. To be honest, it's not my dream job, but I make over $90,000 a year, and I never finished high school, so it's not all bad. I usually start work at 6 a.m. The road I was on wasn't exactly a highway, just one lane in each direction with forest on both sides. It was just past 6 o'clock in the morning. I had just started my day, and the sun was barely up. It was early April in northern Michigan, and the morning was cold, probably around freezing. My hands were shaking on the wheel because the truck still hadn't warmed up completely. I leaned over to turn up the heat when I noticed the empty cup holder in the center console. I Really wished I had picked up a coffee on my way out. When I looked back up at the road, I saw something moving in the woods on the right side. I jerked my head around trying to catch a better look, but it was gone. It looked like a person, but I only got a quick glimpse, so I wasn't sure. There were definitely deer in the area, but I hadn't seen many that year. I pulled the truck over to check if it was someone who needed help. The spot was far from anything, and I didn't see a car pulled over anywhere nearby, so it really could have been somebody who needed help. Once I stopped the truck after opening the driver's side door, I went into the woods and looked around. There was nothing there, so I called out to someone but got no response. The eerie atmosphere made me feel both scared and curious, so I continued walking until I came to a spot where I thought I had seen the figure. When I got there, I noticed that I was standing over a pile of bloody clothes with a piece of D-tape attached to one of them. I quickly looked up and scanned the area, but I couldn't see anyone. The forest was sparse, and I could see a fair distance in all directions, but the coast was clear, so I turned around and sprinted back to my truck. After locking the door and jumping into the front seat, I called 911. The spot was a fair distance from the nearest town, but the police arrived in less than 10 minutes. We went back to that spot in the woods, but there was nothing there. I was sure I had led them back to the right spot, but it was simply empty. I was worried the officer would think I was lying, but he took it very seriously and called for backup. There was a search in the forest based on my report, but nothing was ever found. It's been almost 2 years since this happened, and I've been keeping a close eye on the news since. I haven't seen any reports of missing people or bodies found to this day. I have no idea what happened, but somebody was definitely up to something. I recently made a career shift, but I used to drive long-haul trucks. One evening I was traveling through the Midwest and it was getting late. The air was cool and the wind whistled through the small gap at the top of my window. The road was lonely and I hadn't seen another vehicle for quite some time. However, after a while I noticed a car in my rearview mirror. At first I didn't think much of it, but as I continued driving, the car stayed right behind me. When I saw a sign for a rest stop, I thought it would be a good idea to take a break, possibly even to call it a night. I decided to pull into the rest area to see if the car would follow, and when I parked my truck, the car pulled in right next to me. Most drivers are eager to pass, but this car wasn't. I had to strictly follow the speed limit, but most cars tend to speed up a bit. When I stepped out of my truck and moved to the front of the vehicle, I could hear the engine running, and when I turned to look, the driver was gazing at me. This was strange since there were distinct areas for trucks and automobiles. The vehicle was quite recent, most likely a Toyota from 2005, but it was difficult to determine the precise color in the dark. It may have been silver or gray, and the right fender had a large ding. I cautiously waved at the driver to get his attention, but he just kept staring straight ahead. I could only tell that he looked about my age, wore glasses, had dark hair, and a mustache. Suddenly, the car's engine roared to life, and it started to move toward me. I had to move to the side just in time, and as I did so, I saw that the car's brake lights glowed brightly as it quickly reversed toward me. I was able to hide behind my truck, and while I was hidden, I heard the car screech to a halt, and then it sped away. I stood there in the middle of the truck stop, confused and afraid, wondering what had just happened, and why that car tried to run me over. I decided to call the police and tell them what I could, but I didn't have much to say. I even tried looking at the license plate as it drove away, but I couldn't remember the numbers. I chose not to stay there that night. I was too uneasy about the possibility of the car returning and causing harm. It was a few hours later before I found a safe spot to rest, and by then it was very late. I was restless the next day, staying alert every time I stopped for gas or food, constantly scanning the surroundings for any sign of that car. Later that day, while caught in a traffic jam on the highway, something common in such areas. When there's an accident, a different unrelated accident occurred. Up ahead, it wasn't in a busy city or during rush hour. When I finally passed the scene, I saw a flatbed truck carrying what I was pretty sure was that same car from the other night, along with another vehicle. The crash looked severe. I scanned the area for that strange driver, but couldn't see him. He was likely taken to the hospital, or worse. I still don't know what his intentions were out there, but I believe he caused that accident intentionally. I may never fully understand why. A few years ago I had a frightening experience with a stranger, and this story is about it. I live in a different city than my parents, so I would often make an 8-hour drive to visit them at least once or twice a year. I always made the trip in a single day, starting either in the morning or early afternoon. It was late October, and I was more than halfway there. The sun was starting to set, casting an orange glow on the landscape. As I drove down a quiet road, I noticed a transport truck pulled over on the side. This hazard lights were flashing. At first I wasn't sure if anyone was inside, but as I got closer I saw that the driver's door was slightly open. I decided to stop, thinking someone might need help. I stepped out of my car and walked toward the truck. There was no one inside, but I saw a wooded area next to it. I called out, "Hello, is anyone?" There was no response. As I turned to walk back to my car, I heard a noise behind me. I quickly turned around and saw a man standing there. He was holding a gun and pointing it at me. He was a big man, probably around 5 feet 10 inches, but muscular. The man didn't say anything, keeping the gun trained on me. I was unable to talk or think straight, so I backed up slowly and continued doing so until I was close to my vehicle. I kept my eyes on him the whole time, cautiously opening the door and getting inside. And once I was locked in, I turned on the engine. I drove as quickly as I could toward my family's town after seeing the guy drop his pistol in my rearview mirror. My pulse was pounding as I attempted to comprehend what had occurred. I had never been in a scenario like this before, and it was really scary. The scene kept playing over and over in my head, making it difficult for me to comprehend. The man could have easily shot me or stolen my car, but he didn't, and I thought that maybe he was as scared as I was. After giving it some thought, I wondered if the truck driver had something to hide. Perhaps there was something in his truck that he didn't want me to see, or maybe he was doing something in the woods that he didn't want anyone to know about. These thoughts crossed my mind long after the incident, so I'm not sure what is true. Eventually, I felt relieved when I got to my family's town, and they were shocked and grateful that I survived. Needless to say, we spent the rest of the evening chatting and catching up. I work as a truck driver and frequently take multi-day overnight trips, so I knew I had to stop for the night. When it got late one evening, I pulled into a rest stop off the highway, which was small and could accommodate only 3 or 4 trucks at most. There was also a restaurant and a small restroom with a single shower, so I parked my truck and went inside for a shower before having dinner at the restaurant. I then climbed into the back of my cab and fell asleep, but I woke up to the sound of my own voice saying, "I really need to pee," not literally, but I really need to pee. I opened my eyes and checked my watch, which read 3 a.m. Despite my reluctance to get out of my vehicle, I had no option but to do so and crept to the restroom to wash my hands. I stood up and proceeded back toward my vehicle after hearing footsteps coming, which seemed odd since I hadn't seen anybody else. As I got closer, I saw a guy standing in front of it. He was around 6 feet tall, dark-haired, and wearing a filthy big sweatshirt and baggy trousers. A light to his right cast a huge shadow over most of his body. I tried to move past him to get back to my truck, but he blocked my path. His eyes were menacing, and before I could say anything, he pulled out a knife and pointed it at me. I was terrified, but I remained calm and slowly reached into my wallet and handed it to him. He took all of my cash and credit cards out of it, so I had very little, maybe $30, but he growled. I told him it was, but he didn't believe me, so he looked at my phone for a moment before ordering me to unlock it. I hesitated because my phone was my only lifeline, and without it, I wouldn't be able to call for help. I told him I would unlock it, but he didn't believe me. He was after me, but I was quicker, so I hopped inside the taxi and closed all the doors. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911 when I saw the guy outside, still brandishing the knife, hammering on the glass and yelling profanities at me. I explained what had happened and gave them the address of the rest stop. I looked out the window and saw that the man had disappeared. No trucks or cars had moved since he vanished, so he couldn't have gotten very far. It seemed like forever, but it was only a few minutes. I saw flashing lights and a police car pulled up next to me. I spoke to the officers when they arrived, and they instructed me to wait in my truck while they searched the area. I did as they said, and after about 30 minutes, the man was appeared. I'm still unsure of where he was hiding or where he was running to, but what's even more perplexing is how he got to the rest stop in the first place without a truck or car. It was very unusual, and I barely slept the rest of the night. 4 a.m. had already arrived. After an hour or two of trying to unwind in my vehicle, the sun rose, and I resumed my drive. I work as a truck driver, and on this sunny April afternoon, my eyes were scanning the road ahead. In my line of work, I've seen a lot of strange things on the road, but this particular felt different because the sun was high and the air was humid. It had been a few days since I had really spoken to anyone, and I was getting lonely. I never heard anything about what happened to that guy because I was far from home and couldn't bring myself to follow up. I slowed down and pulled over to the side of the road, rolling down my window, needing a lift, when I noticed a young woman with long, curly hair, wearing blue jeans and a red hooded sweatshirt, with her thumb out in a desperate attempt to hitch a ride. We were driving along when I noticed a car following us. It was a police car, but its lights were off, so I didn't think much of it. Then I heard a siren and saw the flashing lights, and my truck was being pulled over. I stopped immediately, worried that I might be in trouble for picking up a hitchhiker, which is technically illegal where I live. She nodded and climbed into the cab of my truck, her eyes darting nervously. At the time, I assumed she was new to hitchhiking. I'm not an intimidating person by any means, but I was still a stranger, so I could understand her uneasiness. I waited for him to speak, but instead he ordered the woman to leave. When she did, I noticed that her face was flushed and her hands were shaking. I watched in confusion as the officer handcuffed her and took her to the squad car. I didn't realize what had happened until I heard him radio a report of a robbery at a nearby rest stop. She had robbed the store and was using my truck as a getaway vehicle. The officer put her in the back of the police car and then returned to speak with me, telling me not to pick up hitchhikers again and merely gave me a warning without a ticket. The experience left me shaken, but that wasn't the worst part. Later that night, I saw her story on the news, and it turned out that she had shot a man during the robbery. The gun had been in her backpack the whole time she was in my truck, so up until that point, it had been a good story for parties. But after that, I was really frightened. My name's Ethan, and I was 16 years old when this took place. It was back in 2003, so you can figure out how old I am now if you'd like. It was a regular summer afternoon, and I had just gotten back from school. I headed straight to the basement where I was deeply into playing Age of Empires, my favorite computer game at the time. Actually, I still play it sometimes. Even now, I had been at it for maybe 40 minutes, completely lost in the game, when I heard a car pull into the driveway. I figured it was my mom returning from her job. A few moments later, I caught the sound of someone stepping onto the porch, which was located directly above the basement. Then I heard the screen door open, but strangely the main door didn't. Curious about what was happening, I decided to head upstairs and take a look. As I climbed the stairs, faint voices reached me from the backyard. Peeking through the curtains, I noticed two men standing there quietly talking and glancing toward the windows. At first I assumed they might be acquaintances of my older sister, but then I realized they were complete strangers. They were too old to be friends with either of us, at least 26 or 27. One of them was on the heavier side, wearing a blue hoodie, while the other was an average build, dressed in a plain black t-shirt. Both had short, scruffy beards. As one of them walked past a different window, a chill ran down my spine. Something wasn't right. I tried to think of a logical reason for their presence, but nothing made sense. My parents never scheduled repairs or visits like this without letting me know, especially when I was alone. Realizing the situation might escalate, I knew I had to act quickly. I moved to the back door and cautiously peeked out through the curtains. The two men were still there, shifting around and looking uneasy. Then one of them tried to turn the handle of the back door. Thankfully it was locked. He jiggled it twice and then gave the door a hard thump, almost like he was venting his frustration. I grabbed my phone and tried to be as quiet as possible, since I didn't think they knew I was inside. I called my mom at work, and as soon as I told her what was happening, she called the police and told me to stay put. I tried to remain calm, but I could hear the men outside moving from window to window, figuring it would be safer to hide. I slipped into my closet and remained as silent as I could for what seemed like an eternity. After 10 or so nerve-wracking minutes, I finally heard the sirens. I was afraid the men were going to break a window, but they didn't, so I assumed they were worried about making too much noise that might alert someone. As the noise got closer, I heard loud shouts outside telling the men to get down and raise their hands as they left my hiding place. I cautiously looked out my bedroom window, but couldn't see much, so I moved to my sister's room for a better view. I was fortunate that these men took their time checking doors instead of forcing their way in right away, because that delay gave me the chance to call for help before things could get out of control. This happened quite a few years ago, so I apologize if some parts feel vague. I've buried this memory for reasons that will soon become clear, but I've realized that it's not something I should keep hidden. I saw the two men being handcuffed and led to a police car. The nightmare was over, and one of the officers stayed with me until my mom arrived home, which was only a short while later. About half an hour into the game, one of the players made a poor move, and Danny slammed his hand on the remote in frustration, accidentally turning off the TV. "What's your problem?" My brother Danny and I were hanging out in my room alone at home, watching a basketball game on TV. We were shouting at the screen whenever our team made a mistake. When I switched the TV back on, I remarked, but as soon as the screen loaded, we heard heavy, rapid footfall coming from below. Danny and I paused instantly, looking at the bedroom door. I turned down the TV level so I could hear it better. Danny replied in a trembling voice, "I think someone's in the house, but it's probably the cat." I tried to remain calm, but Danny wasn't taking any risks, so he got up and closed the door. I heard a click and realized that if someone had been inside, the noise may have revealed where we were. I tried to tell myself it was just the tabby cat, but more footsteps echoed. Danny mumbled, "That's not the cat," from below. His anxious countenance began to rub off on me, and I decided to take him seriously. We turned off the bedroom light, leaving the room in complete darkness. I knelt by the door and put my ear to it as Danny fumbled about for anything we might use as a weapon. Since the walls and door were thin, I assumed I would hear any sound coming from the other side, but initially there was just stillness. When I lay on my stomach and peered through the small opening beneath the door, I saw nothing at first. However, after concentrating more, I noticed a pair of scuffed work boots moving slowly down the hallway. My heart raced as I silently got back up and tiptoed over to Danny, whispering, "Someone's here." I thought Danny might faint, so I grabbed him and led him to the window. I slid it open quietly and looked down at the ground about a story below. Danny was still frozen, seemingly detached from reality, so it was up to me to act. I pried Danny's phone out of his hand. It had one of those fingerprint locks, and he put his thumb on the screen. The phone beeped loudly, and my stomach dropped as we heard footsteps racing toward the bedroom door. I quickly dialed 911 and swung one leg out the window. Suddenly, there was pounding on the door, followed by a deep, angry voice that yelled, "I'm going to get you." My heart almost stopped. I climbed out onto the porch roof and yelled for Danny to follow me. He snapped out of his daze, scrambled to the window, and climbed out. I whispered, "We need to jump." Danny hesitated on the edge of the roof, and I jumped, first landing awkwardly and twisting my ankle in pain. Then, I looked up and saw that Danny was making the sign of the cross on his chest before jumping. He hit the ground in a roll, got up, and rubbed his neck before I realized that our cat was still in my pocket. I told the 911 operator that we needed the police right away, and she reassured me that officers were on their way and told us to stay on the line. Tears welled up as we slowly made our way back toward the house, worried about what we would find. When the cops arrived, we sat on the curb, too shaken to do anything but wait. The officers searched the house, but were unable to find the intruder, so we were relieved, and brought out our cat Smokey, and I held him tightly. Although the police claimed there was no evidence of a break-in, no stolen property, and no indication that anyone had been there at all, I know what happened to us was real because I haven't slept well since that night, and now I always lock my door and keep Smokey in my room. I apologized in private for leaving him behind. Since my mom worked late shifts as a caregiver at an aged living home when I was younger, from 5:30 p.m. to 1:30 a.m., Danny placed security cameras around the house, and nothing comparable has occurred. She used to hire a babysitter for my younger brother Lucas and me, but once we were old enough we stayed home alone. We liked it because it made us feel independent and responsible. Neither of us was the type to cause trouble. We were actually pretty well behaved and good at school. We'd finish our homework without being told, then spend the rest of the evening watching TV or just relaxing. Our living room faced the street, and there was a large window near the television so we could see the sidewalk. and passing cars out of the corner of our eyes while watching. It was a calm night with only a few cars driving by and the occasional person walking. However, after a while I noticed something out of blue minivan from the early 2000s passed by our house several times. I stopped paying attention to the show and focused on the street instead. After the van passed a few more times, I told Lucas about it. He hadn't noticed because he was engrossed in the program. We both sat there keeping an eye on the street, and sure enough, the van went by 2 more times in a span of just a few minutes. The van driving back and forth was strange, but we initially thought the driver might be lost. However, when it passed again multiple times, we began to feel uneasy. Both of us were glued to the window, but after a short while the van stopped coming, we were relieved and went back to watching TV. It was getting late, so Lucas and I decided it was time for bed. He headed upstairs, and I walked past the window to turn off the lights. That's when I saw something that made my heart race. The van was parked across the street from our house, just far enough out of view from where we had been sitting earlier. I quickly closed the curtains, but left a small gap to peek through. Inside the van, I saw a man sitting in the driver's seat. I wondered if he'd been there the entire time. It was hard to see him clearly, but one detail stood out: his eyes. They reflected the glow of the street lights, giving them a menacing, almost golden hue. I wasn't sure if he saw me behind the curtains, but he was definitely staring at our house. Panicking, I called Lucas downstairs. He looked out the window, spotted the man, and whispered, "I think he saw me." We were both terrified. After a brief discussion, we decided to call our mom at work. Normally, we prided ourselves on being independent and didn't want to disturb her. But this situation was different. As soon as we explained what was happening, she left work immediately and drove home. Less than 15 minutes later, we saw her car pull into the driveway. I looked back toward the street, but the van was gone. It must have left the moment my mom arrived. We never found out who the man was or what he wanted. My mom reported the incident to the police, but without a license plate number, there wasn't much they could do. The experience shook all of us, and for about a year afterward, my mom hired a babysitter again when she worked nights. My name is Alex, and this story is about one of the first times my parents left me home by myself. I was probably around 11 or 12 back then. They had started leaving me alone occasionally when I was about 9. Looking back, I realized that might be considered a bit young, but that's just how things were in my family. My mom had a strict rule: never answer the door or the phone when no one else was home. Of course, I didn't always follow the rules. Sometimes I'd pick up the phone, especially if I thought it might be one of my friends. I was watching TV in the living room at around 8 p.m. when the doorbell rang. At first, I ignored it and continued watching my show, but then curiosity got the better of me, so I got up and walked toward the front of the house. I didn't intend to open the door. I just wanted to sneak a peek through the window to see who it was. Missing a call from them felt like missing out at the time, because my dad was away on a work trip and my mom had gone out for something I can't quite recall. Standing, a man in his 40s was wearing what appeared to be a work uniform. He was wearing a blue shirt with a collar and a name tag, but I couldn't make out what it was. I was only observing him for a few seconds when he turned to face me. Our eyes locked, and I froze as he waved and said, "Hey kid, we got a report of a gas problem. Can you let me in?" My heart raced as I quickly closed the curtain and backed away from the window. I knew I wasn't supposed to open the door, but the idea of a gas problem sounded serious. Hesitating, I finally unlocked the door and opened it just a crack. The man was cheerful and polite. He explained that he needed to check the gas lines inside the house. I told him I wasn't supposed to let strangers in, but he then asked, "Can I speak with your mom or dad?" That's when I felt a chill run down my spine. It hit me that if I admitted I was alone, he could do whatever he wanted. He was probably trying to figure that out. As soon as I opened the door, panicking, I tried to come up with a lie. The best I could manage was to tell him that my dad was in the shower. I hoped that would buy me a little time. We stood there awkwardly for what felt like forever. The tension was unbearable, and I felt like I might cry. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw one of my neighbors across the street walking her dog. She spotted me on the porch with the man and must have sensed something was off. As soon as he noticed her heading our way, his demeanor changed. He turned, walked briskly back to a white van parked nearby, got in, and drove off without saying a word. My neighbor called out to me asking who that man was. I told her what had happened, that he claimed to be from the gas company and was checking for a leak. She stayed calm, but firmly told me to go back inside while she called my mom. I learned a valuable lesson. That night could have been much worse, and I'll never forget how terrifying it felt to be in that situation. My mom came home in a hurry, and when she heard what had happened, she called the police right away. Later, my mom called the gas company, and they confirmed that they hadn't sent anyone out and that there were no reports of a gas issue. We never found out who that man was or what he wanted, but that night could have been much worse. This incident occurred during Thanksgiving last year, and all of my housemates went home to celebrate with their families. I'm a 26-year-old woman who lived in a house with some of my old college friends. We had all graduated about 5 years prior, but fortunately we ended up working in the same city, so we decided to move in together. However, I have a tense relationship with my parents, so I remained home and had the whole house to myself. In addition, I wanted to go to a small business gathering at a local pub, where we had some drinks and spoke about work for a few hours. At about 10 o'clock at night, I made the decision to go home early in order to unwind with Netflix and get into bed at a respectable hour. When the car arrived, I waited on the curb for it. I got into the back seat, and the driver, a bald man in his mid-40s, was friendly and chatty, even though I wasn't in the mood to talk. He asked me casual questions about my plans for the evening, and when I told him that I had been out with coworkers and that my housemates were away for Thanksgiving, he laughed awkwardly and said, "So you're home alone tonight?" He gave me a quick smile as he looked at me in the rearview mirror. My stomach dropped. I realized I'd made a mistake by telling a stranger I was alone and had already shared my home address. I tried to brush off the uneasy feeling, convincing myself he was probably harmless. When we reached my house, I thanked him and got out. After walking inside and locking the front door, I peeked out the window and felt a wave of relief as I watched the car drive away. I changed into my pajamas and settled into bed watching something on my laptop. That's when I heard a long, slow, creaking noise coming from downstairs. It sounded like a door being opened carefully. My heart sank as I realized I hadn't checked or locked the back door. I quickly shut my laptop, placing it on my nightstand, and stood by my bedroom door, straining to hear any sounds. A faint but unmistakable noise reached my ears. Footsteps moving around downstairs. Someone was inside the house. I panicked for a moment, but managed to keep myself composed. I moved my dresser in front of the door, hoping to barricade it. But the sound of footsteps grew louder and faster. My heart raced as I realized that blocking the door had likely revealed my location. I darted into the closet and whispered a call to 911. The operator reassured me that officers were on their way and told me to stay as calm as possible. They said it would only take a few minutes, but those minutes felt endless. Then I heard a pounding on my bedroom door. Whoever was on the other side was trying to break in. The dresser wouldn't hold for long. Desperate, I shouted that the police were on their way. To my relief, the noise stopped. Moments later, the sound of sirens filled the air. A few tense minutes passed before a female officer knocked on my door and assured me it was safe to come out. She explained they had apprehended the intruder. As I stepped outside, I told her about the unsettling interaction I'd had with my ride earlier. When we walked out to the street, I froze. Sitting in the back of a police car was the man who had driven me home. The same Uber driver. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't heard that creak from downstairs. It's terrifying to think about. If there's one lesson from this ordeal, it's this: never share too much with a stranger, especially if you're home alone. My name is Ethan and I live in what many believe to be a haunted house in Calgary, Alberta. My mom and sister were convinced of this long before I was. I used to doubt the idea of ghosts until something eerie happened to me. I'm 20 now, but this story takes place when I was 18 during the middle of July. Let me first share some of the strange things that occurred to my mom and sister before my own experience. Both my mom and sister had episodes of sleep paralysis in our house, something they had never experienced before moving here. They described it like this: they would wake up feeling like a heavy weight was pressing on their chests, as though someone was sitting on them. They were unable to speak or move, which, if you think about it, is terrifying. Another thing that happened to both of them was that their blankets were pulled off while they were sleeping. My sister had this happen multiple times, but my mom only had it happen once. Now that you know the background, I'll tell you about the event that made me a believer. On a Saturday, my mom had taken my sister to her swimming lessons. I was home alone in my room playing online games with a friend. After we logged off, I said goodbye on the call, shut down my computer, and flopped onto my bed. I opened up YouTube to watch a new video by my favorite content creator. As I lay there, I began to hear noises coming from the kitchen. It sounded like someone was moving dishes in the sink. This struck me as odd because I was alone in the house. I paused, listening closely. Soon I heard what sounded like cabinets opening and closing. Being a bit naive, I assumed my mom and sister must have returned early. I walked down the hallway to check, but to my shock it wasn't them, and instead, at the far end of the hall leading to the kitchen, I saw a shadowy figure, like a dark, misty outline of a person. I froze, completely stunned. I couldn't wrap my head around what I was seeing. After what felt like forever, I bolted back to my room and slammed the door shut. I pressed my body against it, trying to keep it closed even though nothing was chasing me. My phone was on the bed, so I slid over to grab it and texted my mom asking her what to do. She told me to leave the house immediately and go to a friend's place until she got home. I peeked out the door and down the hall. The coast was clear. Summoning all my courage, I grabbed my skateboard, ran down the hall, and hurried out the front door. I stopped at the end of the driveway to grab my shoes, and then I hopped on my skateboard and took off, almost losing my balance a few times. When I arrived at my friend's house, I told him what I had seen, and to my surprise, he believed me. He told me that once, when he was staying at my place, he had woken up in the middle of the night while sleeping on the couch in the living room, which was right next to the kitchen. He claimed to have seen a dark figure standing there, staring down the hall toward the bedrooms. At the time, he thought it was a dream because he was half asleep, so he never mentioned it. We carefully returned inside the house to investigate when my mother and sister arrived home. Disturbed dishes were out of place and the cabinets were all hanging open. None of us wanted to stay there that night, so we went to our aunt's house, which was about 20 minutes away. The next day, when we returned, everything in the house was back to normal except for one strange thing: all the lights were on. Since then, I've been a firm believer in ghosts and the supernatural. This just happened about an hour ago, and I'm still shaken up. My close friend and I were at home by ourselves, as we had been For a while, every time he visits, we go to the forest near my house, and usually nothing exciting happens. We toss rocks, snap some twigs, just innocent fun. But this time it was different. We headed outside towards the forest, and the walk there was uneventful. But as soon as we arrived, something felt strange. The area was unusually dark, and many trees were knocked down. It didn't look like the place I remembered. Despite this, we continued on messing around as usual. At some point, my friend turned to me and suggested we should head back. I glanced at my phone to check the time. It had only been half an hour since we arrived. I wanted to stay longer since we still had hours before anyone would expect us home, so we pressed on exploring further. Along the way, we found odd things: a crushed soda can that looked like it was from the 90s, and an old wee toy booth that seemed even older. We decided to go deeper into the woods than we ever had before, which wasn't saying much since we'd never ventured far after While we reached a spot I recognized, it marked the farthest I'd ever gone in the forest. It was a makeshift bridge formed by a fallen tree over a stream. I'd seen it before, but this time something was different. Perched on the bridge was a small object. As we got closer, I realized it was an animal skull. It was clean and bright white, a deer skull, sitting there like it had been placed intentionally. I had no idea who could have put it there, or what happened to the rest of the deer. Across the stream was a steep hill, and at the top of it sat an eerie little cabin. While we were looking around, a faint creaking noise or high-pitched sound came from the direction of the cabin. Startled us, and we bolted. My friend screamed as we ran, but I didn't stop to ask why. We didn't slow down until we reached the edge of the forest and stepped onto the pavement, catching our breath. I asked him why he screamed. He said he heard footsteps right next to him. When we finally got back to my house, we noticed the garage door was open. Unsure if we had left it that way or if someone else had opened it, we ran inside and locked the door. I checked the house and turned on the alarm system. Still alone, I wished my family would come back soon. Now we're sitting here nearly 2 hours later, and the unsettling feeling from those creepy woods hasn't left me. I was at home one evening by myself. My family had gone to watch my sister's soccer match, so I decided to stay home and play computer games instead. Then, I heard a soft tapping on the front door, which was strange because we had a doorbell. I thought it might just be someone mistaking our house for someone else's, but then I heard a knock on the back door as well. I cautiously made my way downstairs, peeking through the window near the front door, but I saw nothing walking toward the back of the house. I froze when I got to the back door, where a man in his 50s with a scruffy gray beard and a plaid jacket was standing on the porch. He tried to get me to open the door, but something about his eyes made my stomach turn. I refused, and he yelled, "I know you're in there by yourself." As his efforts to break in became noisier, I heard the door frame cracking as he banged at it with shaking hands. Panic struck as he began hammering on the door, trying to force his way inside. Terrified, I ran upstairs and locked myself in my mom's office. I then grabbed the phone and rang 911. The man's pounding persisted until I eventually heard the far-off wail of sirens, and when the police arrived, the man had already left. My family returned soon after, clearly shaken by what I had told them, and they were relieved that I was unharmed but terrified of what might have happened. The police apprehended the man the following day, and that night I couldn't sleep because every little sound in the house made my heart race. I kept replaying the incident, wondering why the stranger had picked our house. The police said he was just a drifter who had chosen our house at random, but I didn't feel comfortable with that explanation. The following day, I began looking for answers. I learned that the man had a history of minor offenses and some serious charges. Something about this attack felt personal, so I looked online for any possible family connection. Eventually, I came across an old news article about an armed robbery at a local store a few blocks from our house, where the man had been arrested for threatening the cashier with a weapon. I was shocked to learn that my dad had witnessed the robbery, and I realized that the man had probably targeted our home out of retaliation. The police were shocked, but they promised to provide additional security even though the man was in custody. My family was shaken by the experience, so we put up a security system, began carrying pepper spray, and were more wary about allowing strangers inside. I even downloaded a safety app on my phone that included a panic button. I was disturbed for weeks after the occurrence. I had trouble sleeping and kept checking the locks before going to bed. My parents told me we were safe. Months have gone by since that night, and although the fear has subsided, it hasn't completely gone away. The experience taught me to always be on guard and follow my instincts. When I was 11 years old, I was staying alone in our small suburban house for the night while my parents were away visiting relatives. I begged them to let me stay behind, promising to follow all the rules and act responsibly. As the hours went by, though, I began to regret my decision. The wind was roaring outside, and the windows were being battered by heavy rain. To divert my attention, I turned on the television, but during every commercial break, I heard strange noises coming from outside. I kept telling myself that it was just the storm, but an unsettling feeling crept over me, telling me that someone or something was watching me and that it would be better for me to sleep through the storm. I turned off the TV and went to bed early. I pulled the blankets up to my chin in an attempt to reassure myself that I was safe, but as I lay there in the dark, I began to hear faint footsteps and murmurs. I told myself that nothing was amiss, but I couldn't get rid of the dread that was growing inside of me. I was positive that someone was in the house right outside my bedroom door. I lay still, my breath short, my heart racing. Paralyzed by fear, then just as I felt sleep tugging at my eyelids, a noise jolted me awake. It was the unmistakable sound of the doorknob rattling. My body froze as the knob turned slowly and the door creaked open. I clenched my eyes shut, thinking if I didn't look it couldn't see me, but then I heard it, measured, deliberate footsteps coming closer and closer to my bed. My fear finally boiled over. I sat upright, shouting, "Who's there?" The footsteps halted. A heavy silence hung in the air before the door slammed shut with a loud thud. Shaking, I stayed in bed for what felt like hours, too terrified to investigate. When morning finally came, I told my parents everything: the noises, the footsteps, the door. They laughed, dismissing it as my imagination running wild and blaming the storm for the creaking sounds. But I knew what I had heard. Someone or something had been in the house that night. From that moment, I never felt truly alone. Even in daylight, I would catch faint noises or see fleeting shadows out of the corner of my eye. I never found out who or what had visited me that night, and while everyone insisted it was all in my head, I know the truth. Something had been there watching me in the dark. I grew up in a quiet suburban area where the streets were lined with similar houses, each boasting neatly trimmed lawns and wooden fences. One evening, while I was sitting alone at home, there was a knock at the door. When I opened it, Jack was there with two older boys I had never seen before. They introduced themselves as Mike and Ethan, and although I felt a little uneasy, I invited them in because I wanted to appear cool in front of Jack's new friends. Jack was my closest friend. He was a boy who lived a few houses away, had a knack for starting trouble, and always seemed to have a new scheme. Mike and Ethan settled in right away. They stretched out on the couch and dug through the kitchen for snacks. I tried to strike up a conversation, but they were too preoccupied with their own heated argument to pay much attention. Suddenly, The room became tense as their voices became louder. Just when I thought things couldn't get much worse, Mike took out a knife, and my blood ran cold as he and Ethan started grappling on the living room floor. I saw blood, but I couldn't tell who was wounded. I was frozen in dread and didn't know how to respond. I was left to deal with the aftermath as Jack stepped in, managed to grab the knife, and helped me push them both out of the house. Neither Mike nor Ethan wanted to call for help or involve the authorities, so I scrubbed the blood off the floor and tried to put the room back in order. The thought of my parents finding out about what had happened scared me that night and taught me a hard lesson. The people you let into your life can sometimes bring unexpected danger. I made the decision to be much more cautious about who I trusted after that and never again placed myself in such a precarious position. When my parents first started letting me live alone without a sitter, I was around 11 years old. At first, it felt great to have this independence, but one night, while they were out, I was watching TV in the family room when the phone rang. I answered, but there was only silence. I hung up, and then the doorbell rang, feeling uneasy. I walked slowly to the door, not intending to open it, just to see who was there. When I peeked out, there was no one there, and then I heard glass break in the back of the house. I froze in horror, and as soon as I could, I ran out the front door and ran down the street to a neighbor's house. From there, I called my parents, who immediately called the police. Officers were already inspecting the house when my parents got there, claiming that someone had broken in and stolen several of our possessions. They assumed the intruder had been monitoring and knew I had been home alone for weeks. Even though my parents assured me that I was safe, I couldn't get rid of the feeling that I was being watched every time the phone rang or someone knocked on the door. I also started having nightmares about that night and woke up soaked in sweat. One day, my parents received a call from the police saying that they had apprehended the burglar. It turned out that he had been watching the area and had noticed when my parents left knowing I was alone, so he chose to act. I was extremely relieved to learn that he had been apprehended, but the fear didn't immediately go away. For the next year, my parents resumed hiring a babysitter whenever they went out, but I never let my guard down again. While growing up in a small town where break-ins were practically unheard of, I put my dog on a leash in the backyard to let him roam and do his thing. Later, I went back inside and sat on the carpet in the living room watching TV when a commercial break started. Suddenly, I noticed a large figure behind me. One afternoon after school, I arrived home to find no one else there. The weather was warm with a hint of spring in the air, so I kept the main door open while keeping the screen door closed and unlocked. With my head partially turned toward the figure, I noticed in my peripheral vision that it wasn't a person but a large black animal. His breath smelled like stale cigarettes, and he started talking to me in a low, insinuating tone. I didn't like the way he looked at me, so I tried to move away, but he moved closer and reached out to touch my arm. Mr. Allen, one of the only people I knew in the building, noticed what was going on and moved in front of me to protect me from the strange man. Mr. Allen stayed with me, telling me that everything would be okay. He explained that the fire was probably a false alarm and that we would be back in the building soon. But I was still terrified and shaken, not knowing how I was going to survive the rest of the night. As the minutes went by, the situation started to calm down, and the firefighters finally gave the all clear, and to my surprise, there was no fire. I was relieved to see my parents when they got home, and I realized how fortunate I was to have Mr. Allen there to support me. It was like having a guardian angel watching over me and keeping me safe. I never really understood the value of having good neighbors and a sense of community, especially in an urban setting. I still think about that odd man who tried to entice me to leave the group, and I've never seen him again. A long time ago, when I was still in primary school, I believe I was around 12 years old. It was summer vacation and I was at home with my older brother. Our parents had gone out of town for the weekend, leaving us alone, and we were thrilled to have the house to ourselves and enjoy a sense of freedom that kids my age don't often experience. I'm pretty sure he didn't live in the building. He must have just been some creep who saw an opportunity and went for it. It served as a sobering reminder that dangerous people do exist and that we must be on guard. My brother, who was a few years older, was a bit too cool to spend time with his younger sister. He made plans to meet up with his friends at the park. Even though he was supposed to stay with me, I was a little disappointed he was leaving, but I understood he wanted to spend time with his friends. After he left, I settled down on the couch and watched some TV. The hours passed quickly, and before I knew it was getting dark outside. I got up and walked to the bathroom. As I was walking down the hall, I heard a loud noise from the living room, like the door had been opened. I thought my brother might have come back early, so I walked over to see him. When I turned the corner into the living room, I almost fainted. It wasn't my brother at all. It was one of his friends, Jim, who I knew as a real creep. I had issues with him before, and other girls in the neighborhood had complained about him too. My heart raced as I tried to stay calm and think of what to do. I quickly locked myself in the bathroom. While inside, I could hear someone moving around in the house. I heard footsteps down the hallway and then a knock on the bathroom door. I was so terrified that I was unable to react when I heard someone say, "Hey, it's me, Jim. I just wanted to talk to you. Come on, we can hang out." I knew this guy was trouble because he had a reputation for being creepy and getting into trouble, but I never expected him to break into our house. I remained silent and prayed that he would leave, but he persisted in knocking until my voice gave out. After what seemed like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes, I heard a police car approaching, and Jim must have heard it too, because he fled right away. He probably thought I had my phone with me, but I had left it out in the living room. I cautiously exited the bathroom and opened the door to speak with the police. They searched the entire house and found no one, which didn't surprise me. They told me that a neighbor had heard me yelling and had called the police. I never found out who it was, but I wanted to express my gratitude to them for their assistance. I was also upset with my brother because I thought he knew how dangerous Jim was, but he still left me alone. I couldn't believe he had done that. I assumed Jim was at the park while my brother was with his friends, and when he heard that I was home alone, he must have snuck away and done what he did. When my parents returned, they were shocked to learn what had happened and were furious with my brother, making sure he understood how serious the situation was. They also took extra precautions to make sure our home was secure and safe. After that, I never fully trusted my brother's judgment again. I knew he could be reckless and didn't always think things through. The really frustrating part was that Jim played the whole situation off like he was invited. Since he was a friend of my brother's, he said he was just waiting there. It became my word against his, and he never faced any legal consequences for what he did. My parents did ban him from our house, though this was over 10 years ago, and of course I did eventually forgive my brother. He was genuinely remorseful, and technically no harm was done, though it was really close. My name is Sarah, and this happened when I was in the 10th grade. I got home from school around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, knowing it would be at least an hour before my parents came back from work. Usually I spent that time either watching TV or working on some assignments, but that day felt different. The moment I stepped inside, I had the strange sense that someone else was in the house. At first it was just an eerie feeling, a sense of someone's presence. Then I began hearing sounds coming from upstairs. At first I thought it might just be the wind rattling the windows or the old floorboards creaking, but when I listened more carefully, I realized they were footsteps. Someone was walking around upstairs. My mind immediately jumped to the worst possibilities. Could someone have broken in? Were they trying to rob us? Or worse, I tiptoed to the base of the staircase and glanced upwards. Standing at the top was the silhouette of a man staring down at me. His face was hidden in the shadows, but I could tell he was tall and broad-shouldered. He wore a dark jacket, black jeans, and heavy work boots. My heart was pounding as I tried to figure out what to do. I felt frozen, not able to move. My legs shook so violently that I fell as I attempted to back away, even though the front door was just a few feet away. That's when the guy began coming down the stairs toward me. My legs finally moved. Instinct took over, and I ran across the yard to my neighbor's house. Mrs. Carter was a kind elderly woman who had lived next door for as long as I could remember. I knocked on her door, and when she opened it, her eyes widened in shock. I stammered out what had happened, and she quickly dragged me inside. We sat in her living room, and she gave me a glass of water while I tried to calm down. A short while later, I heard a car screeching away from my house. I assumed the man had left, but the possibility that he might come back frightened me. Mrs. Carter reassured me that everything would be all right, so she called the police, who came in a matter of minutes. They searched the house, but they couldn't find the intruder, so he left. Later, we found that some of my mom's necklaces and a few other valuables had been taken, totaling less than $800. Maybe my escape scared him away before he could take more, but for weeks after that, the man was never apprehended. I was too scared to be in the house alone, so I kept the lights on at night and was always watching over my shoulder. Eventually, the fear subsided and my life returned to normal, but I will never forget that day because I often wondered what might have happened if I hadn't run when I did. It was a close call, and I'm glad I was able to escape in time. One evening when I was 12 years old, in the early 1990s, I was watching TV at home when someone knocked. It was dark outside, and I couldn't see who it was through the peephole, so it was obvious to whoever was outside that someone was home. My parents had always warned me to be wary of strangers and to never let anyone in when they weren't there, so I was apprehensive. I opened the door just enough to see a man who appeared to be in his late 20s or early 30s. He was courteous as he stated that he needed to contact for assistance since his automobile had broken down. I was hesitant since my parents had always cautioned me about such circumstances, but I didn't want to turn him away if he really needed assistance. I asked where his car was and he pointed down the street, but when I looked I couldn't see any vehicle. I also found it strange that he had passed the two houses next to mine, both of which had cars in their driveways. It made me think he chose my house because it might look like no adults were home. When I mentioned this, the man became irritated and defensive, which made me even more uneasy. We went back and forth for a while. He insisted he needed to use the phone, but I suggested he try one of the neighbors instead. Finally, I decided the best thing to do was to close the door and lock it. As I shut the door, the man began yelling and cursing at me, calling me all sorts of names. Remember, I was only 12 at the time. I stood firm and refused to let him in. It was an obvious choice. At that point, I heard him stomping away, still shouting angrily, and felt a wave of relief that the encounter was over. I went around the house and double-checked that all the doors were locked, though I was pretty sure they already were. A few minutes later, I called my parents to tell them what had happened. They were worried and told me to stay inside and keep everything locked, which I assured them I had already done. I sat nervously on the couch waiting for them to come home. Thankfully, nothing else happened that night. When my parents returned, I was incredibly relieved not to be alone anymore. The next day, they spoke with several of our nearby neighbors, but none of them had seen the man or had a knock on their doors. My dad thought the man might have been scoping out the neighborhood to see which houses were easiest to break into. At the time, all the other houses near us had cars in their driveways, which could explain why he chose ours. In the days that followed, we noticed a suspicious car driving around the neighborhood. I never got a good look at it, so I couldn't tell if it was the same man, but it seemed like it could be connected. My parents reported the incident to the police, but nothing ever came of it. We never saw that man again, and life eventually returned to normal. However, a few weeks later, one of our neighbors, an older couple, was robbed. While we couldn't know for sure, I've always believed the two incidents were related.